Good morning, everyone. This is Sunny Lou Williams. I am your moderator this morning for our 6th webinar of the Cultural Linguistic Competency Project Series. As a reminder of vision and mission, the Cultural Linguistic Competency and Health Disparities vision is to focus on persons of all cultures and ethnicities partnering with local and state systems to achieve equity in access, services, interventions, and outcomes in our systems. The mission is to facilitate cultural and linguistic competency strategies throughout Indiana's state and local systems to improve outcomes for populations vulnerable to disparities and disproportionalities. This webinar today, we are focusing on immigration and public policy. We have over 147 individuals registered, and I know as we kicked it off this morning at 10 a.m., there are still quite a few attendees in queue waiting to come on to the webinar. These webinars from a policy framework and actual impact and application and how we see it truly impacting community health is intended to support you and your organizations along with your staff and clients. Gwen?
Thank you, Sunny. Good morning, everyone. We are pleased to have today as our speaker, attorney Angela D. Adams. Angela is the owner and managing attorney at Adams Immigration Law, LLC, where she handles all types of immigration cases for universities, corporations, and individuals. Ms. Adams has been practicing immigration law for over 15 years and has been working in the areas of immigration and education for over 20 years. She previously served as Associate General Counsel for Immigration at Indiana University. Ms. Adams is past chapter chair of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, Indiana chapter, past president of the board of the Immigrant Welcome Center and the Mexican Scholarship Fund in Indianapolis, and has been recognized for her advocacy work in immigration, both locally and nationally. Having practiced since 2004, Angela's experience with both family and employment-based immigration is extensive and well-rounded. Angela has used her expertise in immigration law to help clients navigate the complex and often confusing world of immigration. Because she has personally petitioned for families and helped numerous good friends with their own cases, she understands the practical and emotional difficulties involved in family-based immigration cases. As a frequently requested speaker and writer on various immigration issues, Angela has consulted on immigration policy in the Indiana General Assembly and in Washington, D.C. In addition, she served as the Midwest Regional Coordinator for Bibles, Badges, and Bridges for Immigration Reform, a project of the National Immigration Forum, also in Washington, D.C. Again, Angela, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Sunny Lou. Pleasure to be with you all today. This is a bit new for me, being on the webinar. I really enjoy being in person because I get to see all of you and I get to kind of converse with you and have that feedback. This will be fun and new. I wanted to just give you a quick a side note that I have a personal connection to your field, and that my husband works for Fairbanks Addiction and Treatment Center. And so he and I make an interesting pair. I asked him yesterday, I said, can you look, do you see this? Do you see immigrants in your field, in your center, and how does this? So we'll talk about that a little bit later, how his take on that too. So we're going to talk about immigration today. Immigration, hot topic, controversial. Some people see it as a minefield of messy, dirty word here, especially in politics these days. But it has been for a long time. It's been a very difficult issue to navigate politically, and unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of changes or immigration reform in Congress. What we have seen is quite a bit of executive orders, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit too. What I want to do first is give you a basic overview of immigration laws, the current existing immigration laws, what I see every day in my field as an immigration attorney, the types of clients that we deal with, types of visas that are available, and then the challenges that people face in not being able to get lawful immigration status in the United States. And then that leads to the second question that I have heard time and time again since over 20 years ago when I first worked at the Indiana Department of Education with the migrant education program. People would ask me, why can't they just fix it? Why can't they just go get their immigration status and everybody, you know, all happy and good? And so we'll talk about why that isn't so easy and why in many cases it's legally impossible. We'll talk about the executive orders and the recent things that we've seen in immigration under the Trump administration and then previously under the Obama administration. And then we'll talk about next steps and try to bring it back to you and make it more relevant to what you do every day. How can we work together to really identify some of the challenges and the opportunities that exist with immigrants, refugees in the mental health and addiction field? So with that, I'm going to talk about immigration. Here we go. Here are a couple facts to get us started. Indiana has 358,801 immigrant residents, which is 5.4% of the population. And that is also 2.9 billion taxes paid. 25% of the population growth in Indiana from 2000 to 2015 was due to immigration. A lot of times we say that if it weren't for immigration, many of our cities and towns would not have had population growth. They would have actually had a population decline. That is true for Marion County as well. In all states across the country, there are more jobs open than there are workers to fill them. So we are dealing with an acute labor shortage right now. Not enough people, frankly, to fill the jobs across the board, whether it be a low-skilled labor position or a manufacturing position or a factory worker, all the way up to physicians and healthcare workers and people who are on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. We're seeing a shortage across the board in the hospitality industry, in the restaurant and lodging, in the agriculture, in the tech field. So across the board, we just don't have enough people to fill the jobs. And then finally, as you all probably are very well aware, the US has a very large and growing shortage of mental health professionals. So that kind of tees us off, and we'll talk about how people come to the United States. If you're coming to the United States going through immigration, you are either going to come as a non-immigrant, an immigrant, or possibly a US citizen. So people kind of conflate these terms all the time, so I want to make sure to help you kind of categorize them into these buckets, if you will. As I, as an immigration attorney, see them every day, we are dealing with non-immigrant visas, immigrant visas, or path to US citizenship. So I'm going to try to talk about it that way. So what is a non-immigrant? A non-immigrant is a temporary visa status that's issued for a specific purpose with an expiration date and intent to return to the home country. So the person has not what we call non-immigrant intent, okay? They are not planning to stay. They're not gonna live here permanently. They're gonna go home at the conclusion of their non-immigrant stay. An immigrant, on the other hand, has permission to live and work in the United States indefinitely with certain limitations. For example, if you commit certain crimes, you could lose your green card, or if you are outside of the country for too long, you might abandon your permanent residency, something like that. A US citizen, you can only apply to become a US citizen once you've been kind of on that trajectory of non-immigrant, immigrant, and then you become a US citizen through a process called naturalization. Naturalization is where you go, and you've probably heard about this, you take a test, it's a civics test, 10 questions about US history, and you have to get 6 right. There's 100 questions, you memorize them all, and then hopefully, and it's all in English too, and then you might be able to become a US citizen. There are other criteria, of course, length of time in the United States, and other things. For example, can't have committed certain crimes, and other things, pay your taxes, things like that. Okay, I wanted to draw attention to one fact here, that state and federal laws use the term alien, quote unquote. I try to stay away from that term just because it's not very nice of a term. People don't like it. It's kind of offensive. So in my field, we don't really use that term, but you will see it very much. In fact, it's on the forms. It says petition for alien relative, for example. Okay. So here's some more about non-immigrant visas. Non-immigrant visa categories are, for example, visitor visas. B1, B2, you probably heard of these, where someone comes for as a tourist to visit for a temporary period of time. They are staying for probably 6 months or less, and they are to leave at the conclusion of that. Work visas, there are many, but there also are few. So I can explain. H visas are the most common. You have probably heard of an H-1B. An H-1B is for someone who in a specialty occupation. So that means a minimum of a bachelor's degree, someone coming to work in a position that requires a bachelor's degree, and they are going to be here for a temporary period to fill that job. There are only 85,000 H-1B visas available per year for the entire country, 85,000. So what we're seeing is that is not enough. Every year we exceed that number in applications. For example, this year there were 275,000 H-1B applications submitted or registrations submitted, and there's only 85,000 available. So less than a third of those applications get selected in what's called an annual lottery, and it's completely random. So we're seeing that, and you might be feeling that in your health centers as well, with different categories of healthcare workers. H-2B is another one that has a limit of 66,000. This is for seasonal or temporary labor positions, or not agriculture, but more like landscaping and construction workers and things like that, where you have a season, a 6-month time period where you have a peak load need, and those are capped out, and they're currently unavailable. So those are some, and then there's others like the L visa is for an intercompany transferee, someone from Eli Lilly, for example, coming from a parent or subsidiary company in another country to come work in the United States. An E visa is for an investor or a treaty trader. O's and P's are for athletes, artists, and entertainers. Q, I've never seen a Q actually. An R visa is for a religious worker, someone coming to work as a minister or in a traditional religious occupation. And then TNs are for those from Mexico and Canada for certain positions through NAFTA. Government visas, examples are like diplomats, for example, coming to work at the Mexican consulate, for example. Student visas are another non-immigrant visa category. Usually the most common are F and J. A lot of physicians come on J's to get training in the United States. And then OPT is optional practical training. That is the period of time that a student would get at the conclusion of their degree. When their degree is conferred, they are eligible to stay and live in the United States for 1 year to work in their field. So they can get some practical training here in the United States. For STEM fields, you can extend that for an additional 24 months, which makes for 3 years total. S, T, and U are for victims of violent crimes. The T is for victims of human trafficking. The U is for someone who has been the victim of a crime and is being helpful to local law enforcement in the investigation or prosecution of a crime. And you do have to get certification from the law enforcement official that the person is actually being cooperative. Ks are fiancé visas. You've heard that 90 Day Fiancé show, right? Well, that's real. So you come on a fiancé visa, you have to marry within 90 days. Hopefully you have a relationship prior to that that is legitimate and bona fide. Temporary protected status is TPS. That is for someone from a specified country that's coming to escape like a natural disaster or some kind of situation in another country where we have designated that they may stay here for temporary protected status. So that's non-immigrant visas in a bucket for you. This next bucket is immigrant visas. So if you're not a non-immigrant, or you might be a non-immigrant seeking to become an immigrant. You could be in an H-1B visa, for example, and you could also be an applicant for permanent residency. So you've all heard the term, right? Slang, green card, right? Everybody talks about green cards. Okay, what is a green card? Green card actually, the legal definition or the legal term is lawful permanent resident. Lawful permanent resident, or sometimes we say permanent resident for short, or sometimes we use green card because people understand it better. But that's a lawful permanent resident, someone who's come into the United States who can work and live indefinitely with that permission from immigration. Usually, most of the time, permanent resident is sought through immediate relatives. So for example, a spouse of a US citizen could potentially seek a green card on the basis of the marriage. There are other family-based and employment-based preference categories where someone can be an applicant for a green card through a job, for example, like through let's say, for example, a university wants to petition for somebody, a faculty member, they can get a green card for their faculty member through employment-based immigration. There are other immigrant visa categories that would fall into like a humanitarian bucket. So asylees and refugees, and then VAWA, which is Violence Against Women Act, and then SIJ is Special Immigrant Juvenile. I'll say a few words about these. An asylee or a refugee is someone who's coming to the United States to escape persecution. An asylee is someone who's already in the United States, who's applying here affirmatively in the United States. They've entered, and they're applying for asylum. A refugee is someone who is outside of the United States, who has gone through 5 different international agencies to vet and to approve their refugee status. They've usually lived in a refugee camp for a number of years prior to being resettled in the United States. And we resettle refugees in many different states. In Indiana, Fort Wayne and Indianapolis are the 2 cities that currently resettle refugees. And usually that's through Catholic Charities or through like Exodus Refugee Immigration. An asylee or refugee, again, is coming to escape persecution based upon one of the 5 categories: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group. Only those. This is not someone who's coming to escape an abusive spouse situation. You have to be, it's something that the government is unable or unwilling to control, or the persecution is actually by the government in some cases. So refugees and asylees, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, they face a really unique set of circumstances in most cases because they're being pulled from their home. They're forced to migrate to the United States. And oftentimes it's because of some kind of emergency situation. They had left very, very quickly. They left everything behind, including family, including their home, including, you know, assets and whatever their jobs and everything, because they are fearful that they will be killed if they don't leave. And so they are oftentimes in a very different situation in terms of mental health, and in terms of what they've seen, what they've lived through, and what they're facing now in this new life that they're seeking in the United States. So that's kind of a very unique category. I've got some links that we can share with you later about refugees, but I'll move on. So VAWA is Violence Against Women Act, an abusive spouse situation. If a woman has been married to a US citizen and has been abused by that US citizen husband, or wife. They could be seeking what's called a self-petition through, because of the abuse that they've suffered, they could seek permanent residency on that basis. So that it's there to protect the abused spouse so they don't have to petition through their family member. The family member doesn't have to be there because they're self-petitioning. An SIJ is a special immigrant juvenile, is someone, a child under the age of 21 who has been declared by a court to be, that they cannot return to their country of origin because it is unsafe, or they've been abused, abandoned, or neglected, and they cannot return. So they are effectively a ward of the court, and then can apply once they've been declared a ward of the court and you have the predicate order from a judge. Then you can go to immigration to seek what's called special immigrant juvenile status on their own. Again, they don't have anyone petitioning for them because they've got this predicate order. They're in a special category. So those are the humanitarian ones. And then, as I discussed earlier, naturalization to become a US citizen only after you've been in a permanent resident for 3 to 5 years. So you can't just jump to US citizenship, right? You oftentimes have to be a non-immigrant first, and then a permanent resident, and then, and only then after 3 to 5 years, you can apply to become a US citizen. And 3 years, the difference is 3 years if you're married, if you got your permanent residence through marriage, and 5 years if you got your permanent residence any other way. Okay, so what if you're not a non-immigrant or an immigrant? You might be undocumented. I use the term undocumented, okay, because and state and federal laws use the term illegal. And you will hear this a lot, and it's even codified in the laws: illegal alien, illegal immigrant. I choose not to use that term because it's oftentimes offensive, and it oftentimes leads one to think that someone is actually committing a crime. And the mere presence of someone who's undocumented, it happens to be undocumented in the United States, is not a crime, is not committing a crime. So we tend to use the term undocumented. I would urge you to also try to use that term as well. So an undocumented immigrant is someone who has overstayed, well, I'm gonna back up, there are two types, right? Someone who has overstayed a visa. So they came on a non-immigrant visa, they had an expiration date, and they did not leave at the end of that expiration. They stayed, or they overstayed their visa. The second type is someone who entered without inspection. So this again is a term that we use in the legal field to describe a person who entered without documents. They didn't have a visa, they didn't have permission to come, they snuck across the border, however it happened. They entered without inspection. They did not go through a port of entry, and they were not inspected by Customs and Border Protection. They didn't get a stamp in their passport. None of that happened. So you might hear me say EWI, E-W-I. EWI means entry without inspection. In my field, we use the term EWI when we're describing that, the way that they entered. Okay, so those are two types of undocumented immigrants. Now, why does that matter? It matters because if you are undocumented, you can only fix your status in the United States if you're an overstay. A person who is EWI, who entered without inspection, cannot fix their status in the United States. It doesn't matter what family member is petitioning for them, if they're married to a US citizen, or if they have a job offer or an employer that's willing to sponsor them. That doesn't matter. Someone who entered without inspection is not eligible to fix their status in the United States. Only if you are an overstay, and only if you're an immediate relative of a US citizen. What's an immediate relative? Under immigration law, it is the spouse, parent, or child of a US citizen. That's it. No siblings, that's not an immediate relative. No grandparents, that's not an immediate relative. If you're over 21, you're also not an immediate relative because you're no longer a child. Over 21 is considered an adult son or daughter, and that is not an immediate relative category under immigration law. If you entered in lawful non-immigrant visa status but overstayed, you're not eligible to change your status to another non-immigrant visa. So for example, you entered as a tourist and a B2 tourist visa, and your employer says, I want to sponsor you, I want to get you a non-immigrant visa, but you overstayed and you expired. Once the status expires, you cannot apply to change your status because you don't have status anymore. You can only apply to change your status if you're currently in status. Okay, so if I were with you right now, hopefully I'd see some heads nodding and you guys would be giving me, oh, yes, we understand. Are we good? Okay, good. All right, 3 and 10 year bar, pay attention. I know this is on your quiz, so pay attention. 3 and 10 year bar. If you've been in the United States without status, what we call unlawful presence, for more than 180 days, more than 180 days is a 3-year bar if you leave the country. You cannot come back for 3 years. If you have been in the country for over a year of unlawful presence and you leave the country, you will face a 10-year bar. You cannot come back. So if you've heard someone say, and hopefully I'd see heads nodding if I were with you, just leave and come back the right way. Just leave, go back to your country, get in line, and come back the right way. Well, I am here to tell you that it's legally impossible. If you have been in the United States for over 180 days, you're going to be subject to a 3-year bar. Can't come back. If you've been here for more than a year without status, you leave, you can't come back for a period of 10 years. Unless you've got an immediate relative, spouse, or parent that would suffer what's called extreme hardship if you can't come back. That's called a waiver. So in many cases, the 3 and 10 year bar prevents people from leaving and fixing their status, and so they don't leave. Okay, so that's an overstay. Now back to the EWI, entry without inspection, describes the way that someone entered the United States. Unlawful entry means you cannot adjust your status in the United States. So again, doesn't matter if your employer, the steel company, comes to me and says, I've got these 10 guys, I will do anything. I didn't know they were undocumented. I just found out they've been working with me for 10 years. They've just told me that they've been using false documents. What do I do? And unfortunately, a lot of times the answer is nothing. I can't help you because they entered without inspection. Unlawful entry. Sorry, I had a text and I thought it was Sunny Lou, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't. So I got off track. Okay, so EWI. If you are entry without inspection, if you entered without inspection, you must leave the US and apply, but back to, you know this now, 3 and 10 year bar, right? Can't come back unless you've got that qualifying family relative. Well, in the case of the 10 workers at the steel company, none of them have a spouse or a parent that's a permanent resident or a US citizen. So none of them are eligible for the waiver of the 3 and 10 year bar. So they're stuck. They can't stay and fix it, and they can't leave and fix it. Again, I talked about the waiver, and I wanted to highlight something that it hasn't always been this way. In fact, as more recent as April 30th of 2001, we had something called 245I. 245I, so this whole 3 and 10 year bar thing happened in 1996, where, and if I were with you, I would ask you, who was president in 1996? And you would say, Clinton, and I would say, yes. And then, so when this happened, it passed through Congress in this huge immigration bill, and the president signed it into law, and the 3 and 10 year bar was in there. And nobody knew, and then it all of a sudden figured out, what? Oh, wait, what's this? So then turned around, and again in 1998, I believe, 1996, 1998, and again in 2001, there was this thing called 245I. And if I were with you, I would say, who was president in 2001? And you would say Bush. And 245I, so that happened under both a Democrat and a Republican president. Because the 3 and 10 year bar, what 245I said is, if you're the steel worker and working for a steel company, and you have a job offer and you have someone willing to sponsor you, you don't have to leave the country and face the 10 year bar if you pay a fine and you do these things and prove physical presence and all of this, and go through the labor certification process, which to prove that there's no qualified US worker that can fill that position, then we'll let you stay and fix your status in the United States. That was 245I. It worked. And then what happened after April 30th of 2001? Right, 9/11. So nothing was passing after 9/11. 245I went away, and you didn't hear about it ever again. So that was an example of something that to fix a previous law that was working and that people were using up until April 30th of 2001. It's also an example of politics of this issue, and how it doesn't matter what party you are in, there's good and bad policy on both sides. Then there's 9C. 9C says, if you have been here for at least a year and you left and you came back unlawfully again, or you have a prior deportation and you entered after that, then you cannot apply for that waiver. You are permanently barred for 10 years. You have to be outside of the United States, no waiver available. Doesn't matter if you're married to a US citizen, it doesn't matter. If you have US citizen children, you've got that 9C, you're not able to fix your status. So then we also have these family-based preference categories. This is different than an immediate relative. Immediate relative, remember, a spouse, parent, or child of a US citizen. These are preference categories. This is first, second, third, fourth. You have, for example, I'm going to give you an example here. Victoria. Victoria is 22 years old. Her mom is a permanent resident. Victoria is undocumented. She's mom married a US citizen. Mom was able to fix her status. Mom has permanent residency. She wants to apply for daughter. What category would she be in? She would be in preference category 2 as an unmarried daughter of a permanent resident, okay? So hold that thought, and I'm gonna bring you back there in a minute, and we're gonna see how long Victoria has to wait to get her status fixed through mom. There are also employment-based preference categories for permanent residency. For example, when I worked at Indiana University, we would oftentimes petition for physicians or faculty members who were on H-1B visas who we wanted to keep, right, as a permanent resident. So we would petition for them, usually in the second preference category as an advanced degree, because most of them have PhDs. Or someone who might be an outstanding professor or researcher might fit into the first preference category. The third is skilled workers, which is a bachelor's degree or 2 years of experience or a professional. So this is the employment-based preference categories. Okay, so why does this matter? And again, these are for seeking a green card based on employment or based upon family member. Why does this matter? Because there are backlogs. There are backlogs to get green cards for most of these categories. I'm going to show you, if I can. There are backlogs here. Right now, I'm going to take you to the US Department of State Visa Bulletin. I hope you can see this, and we're going to scroll down, and this is the Visa Bulletin. It's from the State Department, travel.state.gov. It comes out every month, and they show what the backlogs are. What does that mean? So scroll down and look at category, look at paragraph two here. This is a quota system. This comes from the Immigration and Nationality Act. The annual family sponsored preference limit is 226,000. So those preference categories I just showed you, there's only 226,000 visas available per year. For the employment-based preference categories I just showed you, there's only 140,000 available per year. And no one country can get more than 7% of the annual limit. So Mexico would get the same number of visas as Morocco, for example. Once they met that 7% threshold, there are no more, or they create that backlog, right? There's no more for the year. So why does this matter? Family, remember Victoria? I just told you about Victoria. Victoria, and see, these are real family sponsored preference categories. She's in 2B here, 2B. And how long does Victoria have to wait for a visa to become available if her mom, who's a permanent resident, applies for her? If I were with you, I would ask you, and you would try to guess, and you'd say maybe 1 year, maybe 5 years, maybe 6 years, I don't know. Well, let's look. 2B, oh, I didn't tell you she's from Mexico. So 2B, if you scroll over here, you can see they're currently processing cases from January 15th of 1999. That means what? How many years does Victoria have to wait to get a visa? Yeah, I'm not a math expert, but 99, that's approximately 21, 22 years, right? As long as she's been alive. Okay, what does C mean? C means current. So this is F2A. Go back, F2A, spouses and children of permanent residents. So those are current, which is good. But the rest of these are all backlogged. And you'll notice that China, India, Mexico, Philippines all have backlogs longer than all other countries because they have more applicants. Same thing goes for employment-based preference categories. Here, so we're talking about professor, second preference category, professor. He's teaching at IU. We want to get him a green card, but he's from India, happens to be from India. And what do? So we petition for him. He's in an H-1B. We do a labor certification. We find there's no qualified US workers to fill the position. And how long do we have to wait? Well, second preference category from India. They're currently processing cases from June of 2009. So IU has to wait that many years until he becomes a permanent resident. They have to keep him in non-immigrant status and H-1B status, and he can't get a green card until that number becomes current, which means his priority date would be in this box. Whenever he filed, has to be current in that box. So you can see that's challenging. China's pretty bad too. China's got a pretty bad backlog here. There are just more applicants than there are visas available. And why is that? Because we have this Section 201 of the INA, and this is old. This is an old law. It has not changed. The preference categories, the limits have not changed. It doesn't matter what our economy looks like. If the job market's good or bad, we don't go back and we don't reevaluate our needs on an annual or biannual basis like some countries do. Okay, so hopefully I'm going to be able to get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so here's the question. Why can't undocumented immigrants just get legal? Well, you saw Victoria. Victoria is going to be waiting for 22 years. And during that time, she has no protection from deportation, nothing, no status, no employment authorization. She's just in limbo waiting for that to become current. Now, luckily, Victoria became eligible for a program called DACA under the Obama administration. And Victoria got DACA, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And she got DACA, and then she married a US citizen, and she was eligible to fix her status in the United States. Victoria is a real person. She was at IU. She graduated, went to Maurer School of Law. She's now a practicing attorney in Marion County. So she had something of a success story. Her trajectory happened to work out, but there are a lot of people in her situation who can't fix their status because they are in that backlog. Okay, so EWIS, you know now, someone who entered without inspection is ineligible to adjust status in the United States. So this is another reason why they may not be able to fix their status in the United States. Come to me, and I'm going to ask, first question I'm going to ask is, how did you enter the country? If they entered without inspection, there's very limited things we can do. And then you know about the 3 and 10 year bars, right? You already know about that. That's quite an issue. And then you know now about 9C. You know that 9C, illegal reentry after unlawful presence, 10-year bar with no waiver. Doesn't matter if you marry a US citizen. And then you also know about the lack of employment-based non-immigrant visas. You know that there are only 85,000 H-1Bs available per year. There's only 66,000 H-2Bs available per year. That is prohibitive for many companies who are seeking visas for their employees, and a lot of whom are studied in the United States. For example, engineering at Purdue, Cummins wants to hire engineers from Purdue, and they're subject to that 85,000. And so someone who's been through our universities and who is currently an OPT, optional practical training, they are at odds with that limit of H-1B visas. Okay, so there you have it. What happens when a person is placed in removal? So what happens if somebody gets caught? Do they just get put on a bus and sent back tomorrow? No, not usually, unless they have a prior deportation order. If they have a prior deportation order and they didn't go to court or something, then yes, they will be put on a plane and out of here. Or if they have certain criminal history, that might be grounds for expedited removal. However, most people have a right to a hearing before an immigration judge, which in our case is in Chicago, our jurisdiction, we have to go to Chicago. And everyone has a right to an attorney. If you are caught and it's a nonviolent offense or no offense, then you probably will be released or you have to post a bond. But it's important to note that removal proceedings are administrative. They're not criminal. An immigration judge is an ALJ, or an administrative law judge. And only an immigration judge can decide whether to grant what's called relief from removal. So for example, if someone's been in the United States for 10 years and they have not committed crimes and they've got a spouse or children that are US citizens that would suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, they might qualify for relief from removal. It's called cancellation of removal. So that's only if you are in removal proceedings. You can't just affirmatively apply for cancellation of removal. You have to get caught and go to court and apply for it. So that's what happens when someone is in removal proceedings. We are seeing an uptick in what we call easy targets, mothers, women, children, people who aren't committing crimes have been detained more recently. So that's what happens when someone is placed in removal proceedings. Okay, so lack of immigration status. What happens if someone doesn't have immigration status? This is important because it affects you in your field. You cannot get a social security number if you don't have immigration status. What does that mean? It means you can't work, right? But what can you get? You can get an ITIN. What is an ITIN? An ITIN is an individual tax identification number. What does an ITIN allow you to do? It allows you to pay your taxes, to file a tax return, Does it allow you to work in the United States? No, it does not. You cannot work with an I-10. So what are you paying taxes on if you have an I-10? You're paying taxes on income that you received if you were working unlawfully, working without status, or working with false documents. But you can still pay your taxes with an I-10. Also, you're ineligible for a driver's license or state ID card if you do not have valid immigration status. In Indiana, you cannot get a driver's license. Also, decreased access to college. In Indiana, we're one of the 3 states that says you cannot pay in-state tuition if you are undocumented. So you're going to face barriers to getting a college degree. And no financial aid. If you're undocumented, you're not eligible for state or federal financial aid. For healthcare coverage, a lot of people don't know this, but if you're undocumented, you only get emergency room assistance. You do not qualify for other parts of healthcare coverage. They're called unreimbursed expenses. You have to pay out of pocket. And that's oftentimes prohibitive in your field for people seeking mental health or addiction and recovery services. They are either, out of pocket, or they have to find some other way to pay for that through, some non-governmental that's not considered a public benefit, because they're not eligible for public assistance, any public benefits or unemployment benefits, because you can't work. If you're undocumented, you don't have lawful immigration status, you can't work in the United States, so you're not eligible for unemployment benefits. Also leads to mixed status families where one family member is stuck, like Victoria, for example. Victoria, only family member in her family for a time that did not have lawful immigration status. Everyone else was documented. That matters because, especially right now, because under the COVID relief, mixed status families are not eligible for stimulus or other things. Also leads to perceived lack of legal remedies. People we see all the time, we are going for guardianship and probate, and we want to establish a guardianship, but they're so afraid because the person, the juvenile, happens to be undocumented. They're afraid to go to court because they're afraid that ICE is going to show up and pick them up. Afraid to go to their probation officer because they're afraid that ICE is going to show up at probation. Afraid to appear for a traffic ticket because they fear that ICE might show up. Afraid to apply for custody of their children, whatever it might be. And then also institutional mistrust. So there's that degree of, well, politics, right? The policies are not in favor. It draws negative attention. Everybody's on high alert. There's increased anxiety that goes into that, and institutional mistrust as a result. Also, fear of seeking out help for mental health and addiction issues. And you all know this much better than I do. There is that fear, basic fear of, if I'm undocumented or whatever, I may not qualify or be able to pay for it, or I don't want to show up and have to answer the question about my immigration status. So that leads us to additional barriers for seeking treatment, which is directly related to you and your field. I think, and I might be wrong because I'm not an expert in addiction and recovery or mental health issues. This is your field. You know this better than I do. But I looked quite a bit when I was preparing for this. I did not find a lot of data about immigrants and access to mental health or addiction. I found some things more about refugees, and that's interesting. And rightfully so. And you know why? I think because refugees, when they come to the United States, they are documented. They have lawful status. They can work, they can live, they're here. They're immigrants, right? We know who they are from day one when they come. They're not afraid because they're eligible for certain public benefits. So we have a lot of data on refugees. We know that refugees are facing all this separation anxiety, loss of resources, and forced migration and all of those things because they are documented. What I didn't find is a lot of data about immigrants in general, and especially undocumented immigrants who might be living with trauma, who might be experiencing mental health or addiction issues. And I did find something that said that refugees are, there's a high number of refugees that seek, have mental health issues, but a lower number of immigrants, that immigrants seek it on a lower seek treatment on less than the norm. And so, but I think that's probably due to underreporting and lack of data. So I wonder if that's something out there about a barrier. I just throw that out there for you to chew on. I wanted to say a few words about refugees as well. Back to lack of data, I found a lot of refugee information, and Exodus Refugee Resettlement here in Indianapolis is a wonderful resource if you have refugees that are facing mental health issues. They are on my resource list at the end of the presentation. They're doing a lot of work with mental health for refugees. And so that's wonderful and amazing. And I wonder, because refugees, if you look at it like a diagram, right, you have the bucket of immigrants, and then you have a small segment or portion of immigrants are refugees. And it's a very different client, because again, they do have lawful status. They have some degree of support when they get here, and integration, and a lot of resources available to them. So that's wonderful, and to be aware of all of that, but also to be aware of the rest of the immigrant population. What are we doing, and how are we trying to reach them? How are we trying to solve the challenges that we're facing, which some of you have identified in your comments, which I want to get to. But the other thing, going down the list here, ineligible for financial assistance or insurance benefits is a huge barrier. Cultural stigma associated with seeking treatment. Those of you who may have spent time in Latin America or Mexico, or who are actually from Mexico, may know this, but when I lived in Mexico, I experienced this, that it's something you don't say someone's crazy, because it's extremely offensive. And there is a cultural stigma that if you are going to seek mental health services, that you are quote unquote crazy. And that is not viewed well. And so taking that cultural stigma and trying to dissect that and see, how can we label things differently? Or how can we make these services more available to folks who may be reluctant to seek services because of that cultural component there. Language barriers obviously is always going to be an issue. So and that's something that I think is a huge opportunity, because it is possible to provide services in other languages. But we do, and I use mental health providers a lot when we try to prove extreme hardship in our cancellation cases and our waiver cases. We have to get a therapist or someone to write a letter that says that this person is experiencing hardship. I'll tell you, I've got a very short list of mental health providers that speak Spanish. Okay, I think I have about 2 that I can refer to, 2 or 3 that are in this area without having to travel to Chicago or somewhere else. There's a shortage of that out there, and ability to, in someone's native language. Now that's for Spanish. Think about if it's in another language. I don't know where I would go. So that ability to seek help in their native language is often difficult. Awareness of existing resources. I think people don't access resources because a lot of times they don't know where to go. And that's something that we can look at. Political climate obviously is a barrier. People are afraid. I cannot underscore this enough right now. People are afraid. They are high anxiety. My clients who are legal, who are lawfully here, they are so nervous. They are constantly contacted. Did you get my case file? Did you do this? Well, we're just afraid of what's going to happen tomorrow under the Trump administration. What's he going to do next? Maybe this proclamation didn't apply to them, but they're afraid that another one will, that another shoe's going to drop, and that in a couple of weeks they're going to be, excluding so and so and so and so and their brother. So everyone is afraid. The political climate makes people very anxious, nervous, and obviously not good if you have underlying mental health and addiction issues. Only further exacerbates it. No different from people who are, native born Hoosiers, right? But it's someone who's an immigrant who may have been experiencing those underlying and have other barriers and other things to address. Okay, so what about these executive orders? What do we need to know about the executive order? So DACA was an executive order under the Obama administration called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. There are some others I want to just point out real quickly. I'm not going to talk about all of them. Under the Trump administration, we had travel restrictions in 2016 that led to a lot of anxiety for international students because their family members, or they couldn't leave, they couldn't go home, their family members couldn't come visit them, whatever it was. We saw a decline in international student enrollment because of the travel restrictions, and those have recently been, because of COVID, have been extended and for different reasons. Before it was about terrorism, and now it's about COVID, and so there are all these different travel restrictions happening. Public charge, we'll talk about that in greater detail. Public charge is when someone goes on public benefits or means tested benefits. They are receiving governmental assistance. There's an executive order about public charge, which was recently upheld by the Supreme Court. So it was supposed to go into effect last year in October. It didn't because it was enjoined. Now the Supreme Court has recently in February did go into effect. And so what does that mean? April 22nd, just a few days ago, after I even had the prep call for this, we had the presidential proclamation suspending entry of certain immigrants into the United States. They say it was to protect US workers. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So I want to run through these real quick. DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I'm not going to read down this list, okay, because you can find it, it's easy. But just to summarize, it's for people who were not criminals, who entered at a young age through no fault of their own, and may not have even known that they were undocumented, okay? So DACA, your question, can you apply for DACA? You cannot apply for DACA now if you didn't have it before. But if you did have it before, you can apply to renew it. You can apply to renew it. So until we don't know what's going to happen, the Supreme Court is any day now going to issue a decision on DACA, whether DACA will continue to exist. So what does DACA do? It gives 2 years of employment authorization. With that, you can get a social security number. It's renewable and a driver's license. So Victoria, remember Victoria, she was able to get DACA. So that was what DACA was designed to do, was to address the child who entered the United States at a young age through no fault of their own, didn't have a choice, didn't know they were undocumented until their friends were going out to get their driver's licenses and they discovered that they couldn't get a driver's license or something. They're applying to colleges and discovered that they couldn't get financial aid. So that's what DACA, the purpose of DACA, was to address that huge population of quote unquote students who are that was 5 years ago, so there may not be students anymore, may not be children. But it gave them prosecutorial discretion so that immigration won't deport them, saying, we're not going to deport you, you're okay, we know you're here, you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. But what it didn't do is it didn't give anybody status. It just said you're lawfully present, you have permission to be here, but no lawful status. So DACA is not a path to permanent residency. It's not a path to US citizenship. It's not status. you're not eligible for state or federal financial aid or governmental assistance. And as I said, we're awaiting the Supreme Court decision, which I don't know. I don't have the slightest prediction of what might happen. But I do know we need to be ready. If the court decides DACA can no longer be in effect, there's going to be a population of students, and we're going to have to figure, or people who may be no longer have status. What about the public charge? The public charge, as of February, public charge is the ground of inadmissibility that could impact one's eligibility for a visa. So if you get public benefits, immigration wants to know. And in fact, they want to know, they've actually, we have to do a new form called I-944 form. Brand new as of February with all of these applications for immigrant visas. But what I want to say is this is not really a new concept. We have always had to do something called the affidavit of support. So that is not a new concept. We've always had to provide evidence that someone's not going to become a public charge, that they're not going to go on public benefits, that they have a sponsor who makes enough money to support them if they ever go on public benefits, have to provide tax returns and all of that for the sponsor. So this is not a new concept. In some ways, it's just adding layers, additional layers, which may or may not be necessary, but it might be, you know, again, back to the big P word, politics. This may be furthering an agenda, right? A political agenda. Because the vast majority of immigrants, in my experience, aren't public charges. They do not receive public benefits because they're not eligible and because they are working. So the legal standard on this public charge thing is whether you are more likely than not at any time in the future to receive public benefits. Well, that's subjective, very subjective. It's a factor test, totality of the circumstances. Again, this is brand new. We don't know how this is all going to play out. We just started using the form. I haven't had any cases that have been denied. I haven't had any cases where they've had to admit getting public benefits, so I don't anticipate. But some people, there are questions, you know, whether free and reduced lunch, if they got that, was that a public benefit? The answer, I believe the answer is no. But how do you interpret that, you know? So a lot of questions out there. It includes monetizable and non-monetizable public benefits. So here you're going to say, what does that mean? Which I would ask the same question. So here's a slide for you, monetizable and non-monetizable public benefits. You can read this. You can see what it does and does not include. Also add to this list, does not include, this list was created pre-COVID, does not include COVID benefits. Okay, I'll let you read that later. Public benefits and taxes. So just to note, I think it's really important that anyone with a Social Security number pays into Social Security. I didn't say valid Social Security number. It could be a false Social Security number. It could be whatever. Anyone with a Social Security number pays into Social Security. And if they're undocumented, they will not see that money back. Anyone with an I-10 pays taxes. People, even if they're working without lawful work authorization, they still can pay taxes with their I-10. Anyone who owns property pays property taxes. DACA are working lawfully and paying taxes. Mixed status families in DACA are not eligible for economic stimulus or other public benefits. So then we'll talk real quickly about this presidential proclamation suspending entry, which just happened as of April 22nd. It only, and I'm going to say this, I'm not trying to minimize it, but I think there's a lot of panic around this presidential, there was a lot of panic, I know, because I heard it from my clients, but it wasn't that bad. There's not much in it, not a lot of teeth, because it was already happening due to COVID. So this doesn't change much. The borders have been closed since March 20th. The consulates, the USCIS offices have been closed to the public. They're not doing interviews. They're not doing, I mean, nothing's moving. So this was kind of just stating what was already happening, but it only applies to individuals outside of the United States. So if you're currently in the United States, it doesn't apply to you. If you have a valid immigrant or non-immigrant visa, it does not apply to you. Lawful permanent residents or green cards are exempt. Spouses and children of US citizens are exempt. Non-immigrant visa holders are exempt, and asylum seekers are exempt, among others. There are some others that I didn't list, less common, like military, spouses and military, things like that. Healthcare workers, exempt. So again, it doesn't change much. So trying to minimize the anxiety, but what it does create fear. And fear leads to, you know, a lot of this, the mental health and underlying substance abuse issues. Okay, so just wrapping this up here to kind of, I feel like I've given you a lot to think about. I've also identified a lot of challenges and a lot of kind of depressing points in immigration and things that we don't have any control over, or at least it feels like we don't have any control over. So what can we do? I think that's really, really important. And Sunny Lou and the group we've talked about, I'm really excited because I think there's a lot of opportunity here to work together and to identify some of the opportunities here and what can we bite off. We don't want to bite off too much or things that we have no control over, but what are the next steps? First of all, educate. I love this webinar series. I think you're doing that right now, right? You're here today. Recognizing the value that immigrant workers and clients bring to the field. Identify real challenges and opportunities. And when I say that, not just identifying challenges, but real challenges, okay? And real opportunities. Join institutional forces. I like this, I don't know what this means yet, but medical legal partnership, I'm really interested to know more about that. But join institutional forces and create unlikely allies and partnerships for advocacy. Why do I say unlikely allies? Because a lot of times we're talking to the same people at the same table. Talk to different people, get yourself into the room with people who don't know what you're dealing with, people who may have different interests, but in terms of immigration, the interests align, okay? So you may not even be on the same side of the aisle. You may be liberal, they might be conservative. That's great. Talk to people who don't think like you. Join forces, create unlikely partnerships. That's the way things get done. Use your trade associations for governmental relations. Sometimes it's hard because you're one person, you know, you're on the front lines. How do you tell your story? How do you get the story out there? With real data and real people, because that's what matters. When you hear Victoria's name, I'll tell you what, you know, when things started to change, when we took Victoria to the State House and we said, they don't want to hear from me. Well, I can tell them about immigration, but I'm not an immigrant and I'm not facing this issue. I need a real live person there who I can show this is an actual situation. This is impacting a constituent, okay? Or a potential constituent. Okay, so next steps, continued launch industry-based local research. I think that is something that you can bite off. That's something that's really, really important and powerful. When you go to the legislature, you gotta hold some data. You gotta hold something in your hand. Talk to elected officials publicly and privately. Invest in a diverse workforce. Don't be afraid of the immigration process. Don't worry about the H-1Bs. It's not that hard. It is a little bit of added expense, but you invest in a diverse workforce so that your workforce looks like your clients, right? Invest in community outreach to diverse populations. And then examples of real challenges. I have one here, and then I want to kind of throw this to you to really find those real challenges. Number one, the one I have here that I want to thank, I know she's on this call right now, I'm not going to name her out, but I want to thank someone for bringing this issue to me because I think it is a real challenge. Mental health centers will not take undocumented immigrants who are placed in state hospitals under civil orders because this would be unreimbursed maintenance medical care. That is a real challenge. because they're taking a bed, they're stuck in this institution where they could be moved out, but they can't be moved out because the center won't take them because of the underlying insurance and unreimbursed maintenance medical care. So what do you do about that? Some states have created a fund for this specific purpose. Is this something that could be done in Indiana? So that is a real, identify the challenge, what can we do about it? Are there other real challenges? What challenges are you facing? What do you need to know? What tools or resources do you need to do your job better? And how do we improve outreach to the immigrant community and providers? Those are things I would punt to you. And I got a list of resources here. You got some national resources. These are my favorite ones, the ones I always go to. There are others, but these are my faves. And then my local resources, my favorite ones. I'm on the board of the Immigrant Welcome Center. We are working really hard and partnering with Exodus and trying to identify where we can fill the gaps. And especially, we would love to partner with you on this as well. That is it. There's my contact information. You can email me anytime. If we don't get your question addressed today, I'm happy to talk to you offline at some point.
Angela, phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much. I'm just echoing the sentiments of many who have commented in about how precise the language was and how supportive the language that you are using to help them also navigate on their client's behalf in understanding the rules and regulations, so to speak.